Okay, introduction to systemic family therapy for severe mental illness. So this is going to be a brief talk that I'm going to give, and I really want you to just think about it as a way of framing the work we're going to do this semester. I am fascinated by this topic, so you will see it coming back again and again. Okay, so start start here. So this is a quote from Adrienne Marie Brown, who I spoke about in the last talk. A fractal is a never-ending pattern. Fractals are infinitely complex patterns that are self-similar across different scales. They're created by repeating a simple process over and over in an ongoing feedback loop. How we are at the small scale is how we are at the large scale. The patterns of the universe repeat at scale. There is a structural echo that suggests two things. One, that there are shapes and patterns fundamental to our universe, and to that, what we call practice as a small scale can reverberate to the larger scale. So I think the thing about this is that because we're talking about systems thinking and systems have so much to do with patterns and feedback loops, I really want you to start thinking in a kind of fractalized way, like the idea that things are self-similar, like that you can look at something and then look at it really closely and you'll see something similar, and you look back the other way and you see something similar. Okay, so virtually all approaches to family therapy agree on one central concept, that the problems of individuals always occur in the larger context. This context includes the people that make up an individual's family, friends, teachers, peer group, anyone who's important in their life, as well as the larger context, institutions like school and the workplace, as well as larger socioeconomic structures like the class system and systemic racism. So I want to say that this is such a critical shift from thinking from linear individualistic frameworks, from traditional psychoanalysis or biopsychiatry, rather than problems belonging to a single person who is focused on and often blamed for their mental illness. Families and other institutions are seen as systems, and those systems have basic properties that can be described, understood, and altered. So what is a system? So a system can be defined as any entity whose parts relate to one another in a pattern. A system is composed of smaller systems, but is also part of larger systems. So a pile of car parts is not a system, but once they are assembled in a certain way, they become a system that is more than the sum of its parts. So systems thinking really relates to all kinds of different systems: solar systems, ecosystems, computer operating systems, respiratory systems, economic systems, transportation systems, our nervous systems, political systems. There's this idea in systems thinking of systems being self-regulating and tending towards homeostasis. And I think that, one of the ways we can think about this is by getting into more beautiful pictures of fractals, by getting into talking about first and second order change. Okay, so this is like from a foundational text in systemic family therapy called Change, Principles of Problem Formation and Problem Resolution. So a basic idea in family systems is that families are self-regulating systems. Since self-regulating systems prefer homeostasis, they prefer to be stable. The response of change from one member of the family automatically creates a response by the group to return to stability. This is called a negative feedback loop. So if you're in a group of people and one person is acting a certain way, it's going to affect all the others. If that person steps out, there's going to be a shift in the context of the group. It can be useful to think of change happening on two levels. This is a really critical point that I want to make at the beginning of this class. First order change and second order change. So first order change occurs at the behavioral level without impacting the operating rules of the system, and it's more superficial change and potentially less sustainable. So this example I have is, let's say my girlfriend and I fight all the time. Because we're sick of the fighting, we just decide to stop talking to each other about hard things, and we only talk about the weather and the shows we're watching on Netflix. Now we're not fighting, but the underlying dynamics haven't changed. Second order change involves not just changes in behavior, but changes in the rules of the system itself. So for example, my girlfriend and I are fighting all the time. Next time we have a fight, I do a silly dance and sing her a silly song. By engaging in a different manner of communication, I break the rules of engagement and the hostility is interrupted, which paves the way for addressing the causes of our fighting. We decided to go see a couples counselor to talk about our relationship dynamics, and this is the beginning of second order change. In the mental health system, there's a lot of first order change. A lot of like cognitive behavioral therapy is first order change, whereas a lot of the stuff that we're going to be talking about in this class is second order change. Okay. So let's talk about linear causality and circular causality. So when we use systems thinking to talk about human relationships, we can talk about a reciprocal or circular notion of causality. It can be really useful to get out of linear thinking. So linear thinking is, the example here I'm giving you is, a parent and a child. The parent says, I treat you like a child because you behave like a child, right? And then linear thinking from the child is, I behave like a child because you treat me like a child. And then, in contrast, circular causality, it, opens up the space to be able to say, when I treat you like a child, you behave like a child, and then I treat you like a child even more, and you behave more like a child. We sure do have a vicious cycle going on, don't we? So circular causality it often is, something you can like step outside and look at a dynamic. Sometimes it takes other people to be able to step outside and see a dynamic that is going on. So the way we think about this, we can also think about feedback loops, and circular causality opens a window into thinking about the nature of patterns and how things grow and develop, from fingerprints to galaxies, as my friend Kat Aron says. Which brings us to the father of systemic family therapy, a man named Gregory Bateson. I'm going to give a whole other lecture at some point where we'll go into more details because, frankly, I find the man fascinating. But he was an anthropologist, married to Margaret Mead, who was a famous anthropologist. And here's a picture of them as young folks. So Gregory Bateson argued that events in living systems require a different model from the scientific paradigm of linear and mechanistic causality that is appropriate for explaining the inanimate physical world. And so, he would give this example of like, you can kick a soccer ball and you watch it fly across the field, but if you kick a dog, you don't know what the hell is going to happen. Any number, it's a complex system. A dog is a complex system. It might bite you. It might, and that I think is actually very useful when we're thinking about, in some ways the mental health system can treat people in these like very linear ways without thinking about the kind of deeper causality that's going on. So, well, I have this interesting slide here. So Bateson argued that events in living systems require a different model. Communication and interaction are crucial because it is the history of joint action of organisms and environments over time that creates natural and human worlds. And so this is an image of all the centers of diversity for our major food crops. And you're like, what the hell are you showing me this slide for in a family therapy lecture? But I think it's really important to remember that the way we've evolved as human beings has been a process of coevolution. All of these plants, all the things that we eat, at one point were wild, and then we domesticated them. And it wasn't like we just domesticated the plants also domesticated us. We built a relationship between them. They want to survive, and they figured out how to do it by aligning with us. And it's not a way that people are used to thinking, but I think that it's a very helpful way when we're talking about systems thinking and we're talking about working with people. In my early 20s, I spent a bunch of time working on organic farms, and in that context, I learned a lot about the relationship between biological and cultural diversity. And I think that oftentimes the systems that we live in just don't accept the fact that diversity is so important. Oh, I didn't put the double blind image here in the slide because I was rushing, but listen here, I'm going to explain something to you that's like, I think is really interesting. So pay close attention. So Gregory Bateson developed this idea that was actually very popular in the 1960s, and it was called the double bind theory of schizophrenia. And so Bateson's theory of the double bind came from a theoretical attempt to imagine the kind of interpersonal communication context in which psychotic ideas and symptoms would seem adaptive. So he was looking at the way people were acting, and he was like, why are they acting like that? He wasn't thinking, oh, it's because they have a brain disorder in their head. He was like, there's something going on in their environment that's making people act in ways that seem crazy to other people. The double bind theory of schizophrenia originally referred to a repeated pattern of communication within a life important relationship where there were two different and mutually disqualifying levels of meaning about which one was forbidden to comment, nor could one leave the field without risking punishment. So we're gonna get deeper into this, but really one of the things that's like striking that happened in the 1980s is that all of this thinking, basically everything I've just said to you, just was kind of crushed by the rise of biopsychiatry. And while it remained in family therapy textbooks, anything having to do with serious mental illness suddenly was in this other realm. The way I was telling you in the other lecture about how the realm suddenly became so like biologically scientific that they're like, we can't have these conversations because it's not scientific enough. So a few more points here. So just like a few people to mention. So Murray Bowen, who we'll go into more detail about. This guy was head of the National Institute of Mental Health, and he was doing all this research on families and schizophrenia. And the National Institute of Mental Health now does all this neuroscience research, and they don't even acknowledge any of this stuff. But because there was such a shift in thinking, this stuff was left behind. But you will find all kinds of writing about Murray Bowen in your family therapy textbooks, because he's the guy who started talking about triangles. And he, there's a lot of stuff to bring to this realm of severe mental illness and early psychosis that's just been left out because there's been this, it's like a taboo to talk about. And then of course there's Virginia Satir, who like just brought a ton of really interesting ideas to the family therapy context. And once again, she still gets taught, but not in the context of serious mental illness. And Salvador Minuchin, my slide is all not working here, but basically like this guy was really interesting. I've been reading a bunch about him lately, and he, if you're using the language of boundaries, if you're talking about like having good boundaries, like that comes from Minuchin. He was a deep thinker about how to create structures to make families work well. And so my point being, systemic family therapy in the context of severe mental illness was a really important movement. And I put the One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest image here because, I want to say that in the 1970s, there was a whole, like psychiatry as a discipline was really in the process of being discredited. And family therapy, at the time was actually like rebelling against psychoanalysis, and now has been more kind of like incorporated into the fold. But it was like a rebel movement, and there were these houses like we're going to be talking about Soteria houses and John Weir Perry and like that whole realm of stuff. There were places where people could go who were having psychotic breaks to heal without being put on antipsychotic drugs. And like no one talks about it anymore. Very few people. My friends and I we talk about it all the time, but I think it's just important to put it in this context. And one thing I will say is that one of the ways to make sense of it is that in the 1980s, there was this confluence of the pharmaceutical industry and then also family advocacy organizations who were being funded by the pharmaceutical industry. Because meanwhile, one of the shadows, if we want to talk about the shadows of family therapy, was that there was a lot of family blaming going on. And there was like, quite a bit of what we could even call misogyny in terms of like the, this language of the schizophrenogenic mother who was like causing her son to be schizophrenic. I think people like Gregory Bateson never bought into that and understood it in this larger social context. But I think that there was a way that that's how it ended up like kind of being rolled out in the world. So I just think that's important. The drug part is really important. Once, all of a sudden when it's like, oh, we have drugs to treat this, we're not gonna talk about these like complex family issues anymore. Managed care organizations, that was like a huge reason why family therapy stopped functioning in the way that it was functioning, and we can talk about that more. And then I'll leave you with this thought, which is that when I got to the Center for Practice Innovations at the New York State Psychiatric Institute, and I was working at On Track New York, they had this family therapy training, and the family therapy training was called Family Psychoeducation, and it was a manualized training that started off, and like session one with the family, the clinician would go in, and what they were required to do in this training was to talk about how psychosis was a biological brain disease. It wasn't the family's fault. There's drugs that could treat it. There's things that we can help. And everything else that I just shared with you in this whole thing was just gone, like Twilight Zone gone, Black Mirror gone. Like, where did it go? How come no one's talking about any of this stuff anymore? So for me, I have this like deep desire to share all this stuff with you. And the way that we're going to do it is we're going to study internal family systems therapy together. Because Richard Schwartz, who was a systemic family therapist back in these times that I'm talking to you about, figured out this way to use systems thinking to work with individuals and to think about the individual system, and which once you think about it from your own self, you can apply it to the larger context that you're in. So all that to say, I hope you enjoyed this little talk, and oh, we're gonna have fun. We're gonna have fun, y'all.